today we're going to talk about a process we just concluded.
Yes.
Literally just concluded. It's an accreditation process, and we're an accredited agency. And what that means is, your hospitals are accredited, schools, colleges, and universities are accredited, and this law enforcement agency has been accredited since the 90s. When we talk a little about the history before I even came here, but it represents our ability to stand tall. There are policies and procedures, and the data that we collect is all done a proper way, national standards, and we're going to talk about that today.
Right, and it's not just a process that happers like when it's time to reaccreditate.
Oh, yeah.
It's a constant
It's a
process,
year-long
and
process.
our two guests probably will be much more versed at the process than I am. Because when they ask me for something, I start to freak out. Like, do I have it? Looking for the things and the proofs that we need. But I'll let them explain.
See, I don't freak out. I just see if you have it. Okay.
That's true. That's true.
So our guest today. Good morning, everybody. How are we doing?
Hi.
Hi. Mr. Will Davis, who is our director of our accreditation office, research and planning. And I'm going to let you introduce Cassie as we go into the process. But just a real quick introduction in terms of what accreditation is, when it started for the police department, a little bit of our history.
Okay. I will correct you on one thing.
Oh boy, you're not who I said you were.
No.
Oh.
We are just starting the next cycle
Oh, yeah.
of our accreditation
Even
process.
though we just finished.
This Friday, start Monday.
I
Yeah.
told you.
We have a long
see?
weekend,
I
Saturday and
told you.
Sunday.
Correct. Right. We just finished this cycle,
Yes.
but we are starting the next cycle.
It is a continuous cycle, and that's a little bit of a change. It's always been a continuous process, but the new process is every year you do something,
Right.
and it's a 4-year before you come up for the process again to be certified. Whereas in the past it was a 3-year process, and
Right.
so it has changed a little bit. And we're the first ones to go through this.
Correct.
So we're kind of like working out with them as far as how this process will work.
Correct.
So, but we'll get into this
Yeah.
year's process in a moment.
Right.
Give us a little bit of that history, please.
Yeah. The history is we started this process back in 1993, 92, 93. And we had our first on-site in 1994. That was when we received our first accreditation award. And back then it was a 3-year process. And so we had 2 other on-sites. So that was 3 on-sites that we were successful through. And then in 2003, you appointed me as the accreditation manager. And so I've been accreditation manager for 6 more of those 3-year on-sites. So we have been accredited since 1994 successfully. And in this process, they just started a new thing with a 4-year process back in 2015 when we had our last on-site assessment prior to this one. And we were one of the first 100 agencies to actually start that 4-year cycle. And what they did differently is they actually implemented a yearly review process in addition to the final review process. In the previous on-sites, we would work at the PD to gather our proofs of compliance and prove we were complying with the standards, and then they would come in and review all of that within a week, 4 days. And this process, they review it every year, and then they don't have as much time to review the files. They don't have to stay in the file room, so to speak. They get out and talk with our community and with our members and that type of thing. So it's more of an in-depth process.
So when you talk about the fact we did this first in 1994,
Mm-hmm.
we didn't just wake up one day in 1994 and say we're going to start this.
Correct.
To prepare for that process, we had to start a number of years ahead of time. I don't know exactly how long it was for Scottsdale since I wasn't here, but do you remember?
Yeah, I actually started in September of '91,
Yeah.
and they actually had an accreditation manager at that time. So they had started into the process in '91, and it wasn't until '94 that we actually had our on-site and received our first accreditation.
And because I was here then, if I remember correctly, we were a very small percentage of police agencies across the country
Correct.
that were one of the first small number of agencies that actually went through this process.
That is correct. We were the 317th agency in the country that became accredited at that point in 1994. Of course, that has grown tremendously since then, but
Correct.
at that time we were 317th.
Right.
Where we sit in Arizona, how many agencies are accredited?
I'm thinking 8,
11,
10,
I think.
11,
11.
maybe? Yeah.
Were we one of the first in Arizona? I wouldn't know.
I don't think we were the first in
Okay.
Arizona, yeah, but I would have to go back and research that, but I'm pretty sure we weren't.
But 1 out
Yeah.
of 317 ain't
Right.
bad
Right.
across the entire country, not
Correct.
just in Arizona.
Yeah, this
Right.
is national accreditation. You may hear of some states that have
Correct.
their own process,
Right.
but this is a national accreditation.
Right.
Right.
So let's talk a little bit about what, you say standards. What are we talking about when we talk about standards? And Cassie, perhaps you
Yeah.
can
Yeah,
answer that question?
Cassie Johnson is my senior analyst, and she has been with us since 2014, so she was able to go through the 2015 on-site process, so she's had some experience with that. So yes, go ahead and tell us what a standard is.
So there's 484 standards with CALEA. The standard is a best practice way of doing business for a law enforcement agency. They don't tell you what to do or how to do it, rather they just say what you should do to be a best practice agency. And then we rate policy and procedures to meet that best practice. And then we show that policy in our files, and then we show proof of how we make that policy and that standard come to fruition. And so that is the nutshell of an accreditation file. And so there's some standards that are time sensitive and they have to be done and evaluated every year, and they're a little bit more critical and crucial. Some high risk things like how do you use various types of force for resistance or your pursuit policy. And then there's other things like, do you search the back of your patrol car before you put somebody in it? And that's an officer safety and a suspect safety component. And so every facet of the police department is covered with those standards, from property and evidence, the crime lab, our detectives, the uniforms, discipline, and each of them have chapters that are organized. And so
I'm so glad she said that. Sorry,
Right.
Chief. I'm so glad she said that, because when we say standards and policies and procedures, I mean, that gives you specifics about
Right.
what a standard is and how small goes from the
Right.
very largest of risk of weapons and things like that to the very smallest of risks of just maybe how we store stuff in the
are
building.
your shoes shined?
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. So that thank you
Yeah.
for doing that, Cass, because
Yeah.
that's really important.
And I think what's important to the audience is they understand that there are standards that we have to uphold to remain accredited that involve the way we treat our public through use of force, powers of arrest, contact, how we process prisoners, how they're housed. I mean, all the things that we're required to do that actually make sure that we treat our public correctly. Because I'm always advocating, you make arrests, but you don't have to take away people's personal dignity in the process of an arrest.
Right.
And so these standards hold us those high professional standards that we have to maintain, or we lose that accreditation. And that really is a safeguard for our community.
Correct.
Now,
Right.
part of the process is the community actually comes out and testifies. So as we go through a process, we want to talk about that, because we've had citizens come out and both support us, and citizens that have had some running in with us that was less than favorable have come forward and said, hey, here's some issues. And when we are looked at, they look at to see how we resolve those issues or how those issues began and what our role was in either dealing with that issue or resolving the issue.
But I think also, and I'm sure Will can attest to this, I think in all the years that I've been on the agency on Scottsdale, we've always been 90% or above as far as citizen approval of our
Right.
agency, which is such a blessing compared
Right.
to some cities across the United States that
Right.
have zero confidence on their police department. So we are very blessed to have a public that supports us so well.
I agree.
Right.
So this last one's a little different because of all of those standards were shipped out of our building. Typically, they come into our building, they'd examine the stuff right there, and spend a lot of time basically behind closed doors just reviewing files.
Yeah, like files
Right.
in the
which
conference
is,
room.
Yeah, which is kind of like unfortunate because they don't get a chance to talk to us.
Right.
And this one was kind of different because they didn't just, the files all went out of here.
Right.
They were reviewed off site, and then they came in and spent 2.5 days with us just talking to employees, talking to citizens, going out and observing, testing, checking to make sure things were being done, interviewing folks. It was a much different process, and we really liked the process because one of the things we believe in, we believe our public does have confidence in us, and we also believe our department does things the right way.
Right.
And so it was a great way to demonstrate that. So I may have just said the whole thing out, but if there's some other nuances about this last process we just went through, perhaps we can share that.
Yeah, one of the things I would like to point out is that this is a voluntary process. This is not something that's mandated or something that you have to get into. We voluntarily get into this process because we are opting to go for a higher professionalism, and that's one of the things that's important. I think the community recognizes that. That's one of the reasons we get high regards. But yeah, this process was a little different because they had more time to not just verify the paperwork, but they actually got to see the processes in place out in the organization. And so that, I think, gave them a little more validity, and that
More
we
like
were
hands-on.
actually living the process. We weren't just fabricating some files to prove that we were doing it. They got to see it in action. So I think that's one of the good things about this new process is the file review is done off-site every year, and they get to validate what's in the files by the on-site visit.
Perfect.
Yeah, the feedback was they were extremely impressed with our personnel because the personnel knew what CALEA was.
Right.
2, they understood the importance of it, and 3, they actually demonstrated the values
Yeah.
behind it, which was really rewarding to get that feedback.
Could you, Cass, tell us a little bit about who are the assessors and what's their qualifications to be able to be an assessor in another agency?
Yeah, so there is a wide array of people who apply to be CALEA assessors. So our assessment team this time was Deputy Chief William Dean from the Virginia Beach Police Department, and he is the Deputy Chief over their uniform services, so our patrol function, or their patrol function. And then our second assessor was Mr. Larry Herbert. He's the Colorado Springs Accreditation Manager. He's the equivalent of Will there, and he retired as a sergeant. And so they both have a history in law enforcement, and they both have a history with accreditation throughout their careers. I do believe Chief Dean's father helped to write the CALEA standards, so he grew up around CALEA quite literally. And so we have an assessor that actually lives, we have a few assessors here in the Valley. Chief Karen Ashley from Maricopa County Attorney's Office Investigative Unit. She's a CALEA assessor. And then Ed Goodman from Buckeye Police Department. He's a CALEA assessor. He's also an accreditation manager. So sworn, civilian, there's a wide range of people who become CALEA assessors. And they come in and they do exactly what we were saying. So before they would, they get here, they look at our CALEA files and our proofs and see kind of what we have. We give them areas that we want them to focus on and review before they get here. So they kind of have a plan of action. And then we set up 6 different focus areas. Last week, the assessment team met with at least 48, if not more people from across the city. Those are scheduled interviews that they met with in 3.5 days. That's a lot of interviews.
Right.
And they were really trying to measure outcomes for the city and the citizens in Scottsdale with those CALEA areas that we asked them to focus on. So they focused on traffic enforcement, victim services, and Police Crisis Intervention Specialist, PCIS. They also looked at disciplinary procedures with our Internal Affairs Unit. They talked about the Restorative Justice Intervention Program with how we do pre-arrest diversion for juveniles. They also talked about how we do special event management here in the city of Scottsdale with things like the Waste Management Phoenix Open and Barrett-Jackson. And then the last one that they looked at was succession planning and personnel development with our training unit and our personnel unit, and looked at things like we have the lieutenant in training and the sergeant in training program, and our emerging leadership program, and how we develop our employees to be
Because
for
don't
greatness.
they then take that and for other agencies to say these are the programs that maybe Scottsdale has that you might want to implement?
For their own agencies, a couple,
Correct.
Exactly.
both of them said there's programs they want to take back home, their own communities.
Right.
And the interesting thing about Chief Dean is Virginia Beach is very much like Scottsdale, larger than Scottsdale, but it is a tourism attractive
Correct.
kind of city. So they have an influx of a lot of people from outside their community that spend time in their city, and they have a lot of very similar experiences. They have a large event there during the summer, so they have very similar experiences. And both of them said, "We're taking your ID and we're going to
Which
take
is
them back
awesome.
home."
It's
always awesome.
It's just really impressive when when our programs are like, when we have a map at the PD that you know that we have several programs that we have implemented in Scottsdale, and we're proud of the fact that other agencies across the United States have taken those programs and run with them.
When you go to the Citizens Academy, or come out to headquarters, we'll show you that map. I'm very, very proud of that map because it's programs that were started here and we're taking other places. And now we've got a couple other folks are involved that are interested in taking stuff, and we give everything away.
Oh,
It's just-
absolutely.
We believe in sharing.
You just
take
take
it.
Scottsdale off and you put Virginia Beach on it. It's all ready to go. I think why reinvent the
We
wheel?
have to change the map. I'm not sure, but yeah, some of the dynamics. But it is true.
It is
And the
true.
interesting
And
about
we would
Chief-
do the same thing.
Oh, absolutely. We were very in this business. We share quite a bit. one of the interesting about Chief Dean is his dad worked with my wife back in the 70s at the International Association of Chiefs of Police.
Oh my
And Debbie
goodness.
actually remembers him.
That's crazy.
So it's
Good.
kind of
See,
it's
it's
a
a
very
small
small
world.
It's
It
a
is a
very
small
small
world.
world.
And aren't we
Yeah.
also, you guys, and I know we are, but our lab is also like above the CALEA. They also
Correct.
have another
Yes.
CALEA
They have
standard,
a
right?
lab, the lab has their own
Right, their own accreditation
process. They
program.
do it separately, yes.
Right.
And I don't know who exactly, if there's any kind of relationship between the two. I don't think so. I
There
didn't
is
think
not,
so.
no.
So I'm reading your nonverbal.
Two different
Yeah, I'm right about that.
agencies.
Two
Correct.
different groups, but it's a
Right.
similar kind of process.
Right.
You have certain standards that have to be met,
Right.
and then if you don't meet them, a report's written, and you have an opportunity to come back up to that level. But we've always had the fortunate leadership in both our offices
Right.
to get through those processes, and so we're very, very proud of that.
Right.
Yes.
And I would like to add also that the standards are developed by the Commission. The Commission is a group of 21 members from around the country, and those members are 10 law enforcement, usually police chiefs, and 11 citizens or academic individuals, such as city managers and mayors and that type of thing. And they get together 3 times a year, and they review proposed standards, or they review standards for revision. And so they are the ones that come up with these best practices, and they are truly international best practices because they take into what's happening not just in our country but other countries as well.
Because I'm sure from 1994 trends have changed, obviously, and cities have grown, and
Yes.
populations have grown, and we've gone from one-story housing to
Right.
multi-story housing, and
Right.
there's just things that always have to be adapted to, like
Right.
when you do your strategic planning for the year and
Right.
what we're
The
expecting.
standards are constantly under revision 3 times a year, like I mentioned. They are reviewing them, they're changing them, they're adding new ones. So it's a constant evolutionary process, not a
New
stagnant
technology, changes in
Correct.
court decisions, changes in training techniques. I mean, that's one thing about law enforcement. And people say police don't like to change. We are continually changing.
Right.
We are continually evolving because people would not accept law enforcement today like we policed
No.
in the 1970s
Right.
or earlier. And unfortunately, some communities are struggling with that because police departments aren't as willing to adapt and to evolve as they need to in a modern society. So
And
we're seeing that, and that's what CALEA does for us, by the way.
Correct.
It keeps us
Yes.
grounded.
On the
to
forefront.
that.
And
Yes.
but there are as well some agencies that don't have the funding to do those things, and because technology costs money and personnel costs money and things like that. So sometimes they are restricted to things that they can or don't have.
Well, at one time, and I don't know if it's still true, but CALEA didn't require small agencies to have the same level of standards
Correct.
met as larger agencies. So I don't know, are we in mid-range or are we at the top of the
Yeah,
scale?
We're at the top of
We're
the
at the
scale.
top of the
but
scale,
there's
so we've-
4 different groups
Right.
of which
Right.
your sizes
Right.
determines what standards you have to apply with. So they call them other than mandatory standards. And so there's a few that are optional and that they're the best practices, but they're not an absolute must do. And we're allowed to not elect to do a few of those. It's 20% of the total. So for us, that's 14 standards, and we did all but 7 of those. And so if you're a smaller agency, you have to do the things like use of force and pursuits and all of those high priority standards, but there are some others that they just take into account that you just won't probably have the capability of doing so. When you look at the change in everything with standards, on body camera 5 years ago
Good example.
didn't exist as far as a CALEA standard, and now it's a mandatory standard for compliance for a lot of agencies. And so they're really good about maintaining the needs of policing. And the international growth with CALEA has been pretty significant. There's a lot of Mexican agencies actually that are now receiving accreditation. So the last CALEA conference, they had an entire hearing room. So we go to a conference at the end of this year in November, and that's where we're reviewed by the commission. So the assessors are going to write a final report after their time here, and they're going to give that to the commission for review. The commission is going to meet with Chief and Will, and they're going to ask questions about our processes and our procedures and how we do things here, and then they're going to decide if we get reaccredited. And so that's when we actually get our reaccreditation award, and that will be our 25th year of being an accredited police agency,
That's fantastic.
which is
Amazing.
pretty pretty awesome. That's a good anniversary.
Yeah.
Right.
But they're having entire rooms of those hearings that are just police agencies in Mexico
Right.
that have interpreters, and
Right.
there's some Caribbean islands that are seeking CALEA accreditation, and some Canadian agencies, and so it really is an international
That's so
organization
cool.
at this point.
And
Right.
correct me if I'm wrong, but the Maricopa County Attorney's Office is also an accredited
Correct.
agency.
Correct.
So also, so county attorneys, prosecutors'
Right.
offices have also gone through the process.
Right.
Now, obviously, the standards are different, but it's still the same process.
Yeah,
that they
their
go through.
investigative division
Yes.
is what's accredited, and
Okay.
I think they were the first county attorney
believe so.
investigative division accredited. So
That's
Yeah.
fantastic.
Which was kind of cool.
Yeah.
Right.
So this is a process, as you mentioned, voluntary. We've been doing it. We're going to continue doing it. Certainly as long as I'm here, because I believe in this system. I believe it gives us the kind of organization that is just professional, top-notch, meets the needs of the community, but also addresses the issues of the community and respects the community. And I think that pays big dividends in and of itself. I'm glad to hear they're down to 480
84.
because we were in the 600s at one time. So
900?
yeah,
when I got into it, it was over 900.
over
so,
900,
yes.
so it even goes back even further. So you can imagine how overwhelming that is, because the
Right.
400 keeps us going. But we don't, again, do this just once a year.
Right.
We're continually doing this. We have pushed the responsibility for this down amongst the rank and file, where it used to be the accreditation manager had the responsibility, and we'd cram for we'd study for the exam. Now we do it all year throughout the organization, so every member has some ownership.
Right.
And that translates, I think, into big dividends for our community. And I couldn't be
really
more
does.
proud with the work that you've done. Couldn't be more proud with the feedback. I mean, I was choked up with the feedback we
Yeah.
received this year from these two gentlemen. You know, they come in, they look for things that you can do to grow, to develop, and
Right.
make recommendations. And again, there weren't recommendations. It was kind of like, hey, think about this, but that really wasn't even a recommendation, because the things that we're doing are so far
Right.
out there in terms of being progressive, being responsive, and being innovative. It's just a pretty amazing place.
And
we've
it
done
makes
amazing
us
work
very
for us.
proud. We're very
Yeah.
proud to
Right.
have such a great agency.
And I will tell you too that when I started, Jeffrey Smythe was the accreditation manager as an officer. He stayed with our organization and became a lieutenant, and then became a chief in a couple of other places. And now he's chief of Burlington, North Carolina, and he's also a CALEA commissioner.
He's a commissioner,
He's one of
yes.
those 21. He started right
That
here in
doesn't
Scottsdale.
surprise me with Jeff
Yeah.
Smythe being a
Yeah.
commissioner on
Yeah.
CALEA.
He is CALEA.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
That's
It's a
pretty cool.
Real success story for us.
Yeah.
And he's on our board as one of our success stories. He's on our map.
exactly.
I want to thank both of you
Really,
for
thank
being,
you for
being
coming
part of our
in.
program. This is really an important part of the organization that unfortunately our citizens don't really know about or are aware of, or they see that and they don't know what that means. Does that mean somebody came in and toured the building and gave you a stamp of approval?
Right.
It goes a lot deeper than that. They did a tour of our entire organization
Correct.
and our members, and they gave us a stamp of approval saying you guys operate very professionally, and you now have accreditation status.
Exemplary.
And to have it for 25 years
Right.
is phenomenal.
Yes,
And so
very
very, very proud. Amazing work. Thank you both. Thanks
Yes,
for all
thanks
you
for being
do.
our guest today.
That's not your only jobs.
No.
Yeah, they have other
So
jobs
people
to
think
do.
that's the only job they do, but
Nope.
you write policy, you keep you do other things in that office.
Right.
Keep all of our
Strategic
monthly
planning.
statistics, strategic planning, but all of our yearly data, all that,
Right.
generating all the reports based on that data. It's pretty phenomenal what benefit we have from the two of you and your staff. And so I want to just take this moment and say thanks a lot for all you do. For
Thank
us.
you.
And thanks for
Appreciate it.
being here today.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much.
That's it, huh? Yes. Okay, so I hope maybe next time we talk to you all, it'll be a little cooler. We'll see.
It won't be. It's the end of September. It's still going to be only 105
And this
instead of
pessimist.
115.
All right, this pessimist. Until then, we hope you all be safe and take care.
Thanks.
Thanks for showing. Bye-bye.
Bye.